Today on CityCast Boise, Christian nationalism used to be viewed as an extremist, fringe ideology tucked into the dark corners of our country. But over the past few years, it's become part of mainstream politics. And one of the most popular and well-known Christian nationalist leaders lives right here in Idaho. Heath Drusen, host of the Extremely American podcast, is sharing how this movement is changing our democracy, both in Boise and around the country. As a warning, this episode includes a discussion about grooming and sexual abuse. It's Tuesday, July 2nd. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. What led you to focus on Christian nationalism in your second season of Extremely American?
So there's a couple things. Christian nationalism was on my mind because it's been a big topic. And in covering far-right movements, I started to feel like it was becoming more important and getting more traction in sort of mainstream political circles. My co-reporter for the project, James Dawson, he was talking to me about ideas for season 2. And he was like, what about Christchurch in Moscow? And I'm like, Actually, my first reaction was, I don't think that's going to work. And then I learned more about it, where it sort of dawned on me after Jimmy pitched it, where I was like, oh, okay, this can be both. This can be a really fascinating story about a struggle for a town, but also tell the larger story about Christian nationalism becoming a real consequential movement in mainstream politics.
So in your first episode, you mentioned that only about 20% of people support Christian nationalism in some way. I think there might be some listeners who would say that feels like a fringe movement. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. So, to be clear, Christian nationalists are a minority, right? Mm-hmm. However, I think the more important thing is that 20% is way more politically engaged than the general public. These guys vote. These guys run for office. They're playing the long game, and they're strategic. And they're also gaining the ears of people in power, so that that hits a lot harder than folks who are maybe just kind of yelling into the void, or maybe have some followers who like to hear what they say, but it doesn't go past the church pews.
And you interviewed a group in Moscow and different people back east. So what is it about maybe Christian nationalism to bring it home? I know people would say Moscow is going to do what Moscow is going to do. Back east, not really our problem. What is it that people in Boise should be aware of, and why should they care about this?
Well, I'll give I should probably give a quick rundown of what Christchurch is doing in Moscow, because, I realize not everybody knows who Christchurch is. They're a Calvinist church in Moscow, Idaho. And this church is trying to make Moscow a church town. They want Moscow to be run according to biblical principles. And what they're doing is maybe a little bit different than some other folks. They own a big chunk of downtown Moscow now. Now, what makes them even more interesting is that that church actually has an umbrella organization that has churches in almost every state in the country and has way more schools in almost every state in the country. So my co-reporter, Jimmy, he coined the phrase Christian industrial complex, and that's what they've built. Doug Wilson's the lead pastor there, and he's built this operation that has publishing, it's got media, it's got schools all around the country, and he's kind of building a blueprint for a takeover on the local level and increasingly on the national level. Why people in Boise should care is that all they have to do is look to their state house right downtown to see Christian nationalism creeping into politics. They want the separation of church and state to be gone. In fact, they would tell you that it was never there in the first place legally. They dispute the whole origin of the separation of church and state. I would say Idaho especially has a lot of legislators who either buy into that, or you also see increasingly folks on the right who just are worried about taking it on, worried about pushing back, even if maybe they don't believe in it. They're not going to take a strong stand against it.
And Moscow has historically been a pretty liberal town in Ruby Red, Idaho. Like you said, it's a university town, lots of emphasis on humanities and liberal arts. So why did Doug Wilson choose Moscow to create this Christian nationalist Christchurch community?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? I mean, you look at Moscow. When we were walking around downtown reporting, it was mostly like pride flags, Black Lives Matters, placards, and like refugees welcome bumper stickers. And then you're
Mm-hmm.
like, wait, what's that? What's that flag with the cross? And oh, it's like this Christian nationalist flag.
I would say appeal to heaven flags everywhere, like opposite sides of the street.
You're getting a real clash of cultures. Why Moscow? Part of it's because Doug Wilson's dad moved them there. He was a Christian bookstore owner and a really influential Christian nationalist author back before it really became a thing. And he would print kind of guidebooks on like this is how you change things methodically. So Doug Wilson was already there. But the other thing was you pick a town that's small enough to make an impact, but big enough to matter. And Moscow's like that perfect sweet spot where it's small enough that if you really start to buy up property, if you're able to win a few elections, especially low turnout elections, you could make a pretty big difference in a town of 26,000 people. But Moscow matters, right? I mean, first of all, the University of Idaho that is there, the flagship
Yeah.
public university. And Moscow is, a pretty major population center in that area. But yeah, I mean, I don't think Moscow's going to turn red anytime soon. It's still a pretty liberal place. But I think Doug Wilson sees it as a place where he can at least change culture because of its size.
Well, and I want to dive into Doug Wilson a little bit. I've made some content about him in Christchurch, and I know when I was like, okay, Doug Wilson, he seems a little fringy. Idaho has quite a few kind of fringy people. But when you step back, he's considered a real leader in the Christian nationalist movement in the United States, not just in Idaho, right?
Absolutely. I would say that he and Christchurch are one of, if not the sort of biggest leaders in the movement at the moment. And the reason for that is partly because Doug Wilson is very ambitious and he speaks around the country and he lays out his stark vision for America. He makes no apologies about anything he says, including downplaying the evils of slavery, which you'll hear plenty about in the podcast. The other thing is, I alluded to before, he's built this education empire. And that's been really influential in a really quiet way, where he's got all of these Christian schools under his National Association of Classical Christian Schools umbrella. And they basically teach Christian education the Doug way. And that's a strict biblical education, uncompromising on their interpretation of the Bible. And it's an education where the Bible basically is the backbone for every class, whether it's literature or physics. It's infused in everything. And that's been really influential. There's a lot of students, he calls them human munitions, and he wants them to be sort of cultural weapons. He wants to teach kids in his school and his college, New St. Andrews, which is in Moscow, Idaho, to go out there and start being leaders in the country to change things. One thing he told us, I'm paraphrasing a bit, we don't want our students to bowl people over at Toastmasters, even though that would be nice. We want them to go argue cases in front of the Supreme Court. We want them to write best-selling books. Like he's got a plan, and he's doing a pretty good job at implementing it right now.
Well, and I think, we're seeing that start to play out. These groups that have been working towards this, other Christian nationalists and Doug Wilson, they got started in the 70s, and now we are starting to see that play out with cases argued in the Supreme Court this year and the past few years.
And a Supreme Court that's potentially going to be more open to some of their arguments. That's the thing. Doug's 70 years old. He's been doing this for a long time, but he, like a lot of people in the movement, are really patient. They're not, they're not just trying to get a splashy, quick win. They are working diligently behind the scenes, and now they see their moment. And I don't know that they're wrong, to be honest.
Hi, I'm David Plotz, CEO of CityCast. Or, as I can say now, thanks to a few weeks with Babbel, hola, soy David Plotz, el jefe de CityCast. What if in 2024 you got a little bit better every day? When you're learning a new language with Babbel, that's exactly what you're doing. And if Babbel can help me start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks, imagine what you could do in a full year. I got started with Babbel because I realized that my girlfriend, who's a native Spanish speaker, and my son, who's in AP Spanish, were conspiring against me, or I thought they were conspiring against me in Spanish. I wanted to know what they were talking about. And now, thanks to literally just a few weeks of Babbel, I'm starting to be able to eavesdrop. It is rare that something so fun and simple, and Babbel is super fun and very simple, is also so useful. So here's a special limited time deal for CityCast listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for CityCast listeners at babbel.com/CityCast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/CityCast. Spelled BABBEL.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
You spent a year studying and talking to people in this movement that has a pretty well-known distrust of journalists, to put it mildly. So how the hell did you convince these people to talk to you so candidly?
I will say that kind of surprised me too. I thought I was going to have quite a bit of trouble getting people to talk to me. What I told them ahead of time was the truth. I said, hey, look, you're not going to like everything in here, but I'm going to let you have your say and I'm going to let you explain yourself. We sat down with Doug Wilson for a total of 5 hours, I think, over 3 interviews.
Wow.
I was surprised that almost everybody talked to us. Like, that was great. I was gratified. And I'm really appreciative that people did. One of the main drivers I'd like to say is my personality and charm, which, you know, I obviously that big part of it.
Yeah.
But I think arguably a bigger part of it is that they are very proud of what they're doing. They think that God is on their side and they want to tell people about it, and they want to persuade people that what they're doing is the right thing and sort of the way and the truth, quite literally. They're saying, like, very, very loud, hey, this is what we think our country should look like, and here's why you should think that too. Now, I think it's going to be a hard sell for a lot of people, but in their mind, they're doing the right thing, and they're trying to convince people that they're correct.
And there's, it's not really a secret that there is a lot of violent rhetoric associated with Christian nationalism. And in your podcast specifically, you discuss how Doug Wilson incorporates references to violence into really mundane things like education, saying things like education is warfare, and he wants to, quote, raise dangerous children. So how does this violent rhetoric impact his church, his schools, and the community of Moscow?
So just from off the bat, I'll be clear, as I am in the podcast, that Doug, as far as I know, and certainly not to my face, has ever advocated for actual violence. He's never literally said, you should go do this violent act. But yeah, he does use a lot of war metaphors. He uses a lot of war terminology. He sees his whole project as a spiritual war. He talks about spiritual warfare. His dad, Jim Wilson, the book I mentioned before, it's called Principles of War. There's also this sort of biblical mention of spiritual warfare, talk about the sword. And this might be the part that's, a little more disturbing to some people. I think it gets to the stakes that Christian nationalists see in this battle. They see it as a battle of good and evil. And it's not something where you can come to a compromise, right? If it's a battle of good and evil, it's not like the two sides can get together and be like, okay, let's work this out, because there's nothing to work out if your mindset is there's only one way, and that is the way and the truth.
Yeah. And I think if you truly feel you're at war and your type of belief system is potentially embroiled in this warfare, how you react and how you behave and how you, do kind of everything will all be shaped by that lens. And I think we see that a lot in the Christian nationalist movement. Like you said, this really inability to compromise.
And you have seen, not Doug Wilson, but you have seen folks in that sphere, including folks who interact with Doug Wilson and his allies, make some calls that sure sounded like a call to arms in America, talk of civil war. Hey, the government's gone too far. This might be a time to pick up your guns, and that's where it really starts to get worrying. I think that's where you're like, okay, well, man, even if you didn't mean it literally, all it takes is one person to be like, hey, well, it's a battle of good and evil. I need to be on the side of good. Maybe I need to do something violent or drastic in that cause. So that's the worrying thing. Where how are people going to read that in a country with more guns than people? It's an open question.
So does any of that violent rhetoric play out in the idea that Doug Wilson and his church have openly said that they want to take over the city of Moscow?
Well, actually, that is one thing with they're very careful to say we want a friendly takeover. I've never heard from them or seen archive tape of them advocating for that. They say they want to basically change people's minds and have it be an organic conversion. But you do see some excuses for that they make for violent actions. There's a lot of downplaying of January 6th in the Doug Wilson sphere. That this attempt to stage a coup at the U.S. Capitol and overturn a lawful election was somehow not that, and not a big deal if not justified. But as far as taking over the country violently, Doug Wilson is very careful to say, no, that's not what I'm advocating.
Okay. So, but while Wilson doesn't advocate for, a violent overtaking of Moscow or the United States, that doesn't mean he doesn't necessarily advocate or promote other forms of violence, particularly abuse against women. Specifically sexual abuse. And you cover some devastating stories about this abuse and a powerful survivor story in the podcast. What are some of the connections you found between Christian nationalism and sexual abuse?
We did find a lot of folks talking about a real dark underbelly in the movement. Now, Doug Wilson, he says he does not advocate any violence against women. He says sexual abuse is a sin. But a lot of the things he said about marriage and women's submission lead a lot of people to think that it creates the conditions for men to kind of do what they want with women because women are supposed to submit. And we talked to people who are former members of the church, former students at his school. One in particular, she had a teacher at Doug Wilson's school when she was a teenager who, she says groomed her and sexually abused her throughout her time there. And she says that basically it was ignored for a long time. Finally, it came to a head and the school fired this teacher. But the school didn't go to the police at that point, and they didn't dig into it any further. And according to the school, at that point, it was just inappropriate texts. But that is not what was happening. The survivor says she was being just repeatedly molested. So the picture that we got from these women was that there's a blind eye being turned to abuse, and that the conditions are being created as Emily put it, the survivor, creating these perfect victims is what she said, because girls and women, it's just ingrained in them that they're to be obedient to men. So of course, if you're a 17-year-old and an adult man starts to abuse you, if you've learned that, you could see how it would be very difficult to speak up.
Wow. I think that is going to be really powerful. And I'm glad that she felt empowered enough to speak up and really share about her experience, because I think that will be really important for people to hear.
It's a powerful story.
So one thing that you mentioned on the podcast is that you're Jewish. And I guess I'm really curious. What was it like to be a Jewish guy among all of these people who are pretty open about wanting to take away your rights for not being Christian or not being the right kind of Christian?
Yeah, it was weird. I mean, everybody I talked to, every Christian nationalist I talked to was unfailingly polite, which made it kind of weirder because people were sort of politely telling me that my worldview was bad for America, which is almost a direct quote, and that because of that, I shouldn't be able to run for office, for example. That, as I say in the podcast, I sort of quickly realized I had enemies that I never even knew about because I was told that I was an enemy of God.
Wow, that's a pretty, like, to your face, they're saying that?
Yes, and more importantly, to my microphone. So thank you. I mean, so you all get to hear it. But yeah, no, people were telling me this to my face, and it was surreal. I knew it'd be a little strange going into it, and I thought a lot about, am I the right person to tell this story? I came to the conclusion that I'm like, oh no, I think I actually have a really good perspective on this because I am an outsider and I'm in the out group if these guys get their way. So
yeah,
I kind of like started to viscerally understand. I'm like, oh, the stakes are high, and not in a sort of theoretical way. It's me. They're talking about me.
I think being in that targeted group definitely changes your perspective in a way that is really important because you would, like you said, you would feel the impacts of this. This would, they're talking about you. They're talking about disenfranchising and disempowering you. And that's, I definitely think, an important perspective in covering a topic like this.
Yeah, it was fascinating for me. Also difficult sometimes. I mean, you got to like process these things and be like, oh, like, this is very interesting, but also like, huh.
Yeah. Did he just really say that?
Oh. But so, yeah. And, an important thing about the podcast, too, for listeners to know is that most of the pushback that we got on Christchurch, and we have a lot of it, most of the people who are pushing back are Christians. And the people who aren't Christians mostly were former members of the church who knew exactly how it operated and made a conscious decision to leave. So, I think it's important, right? Because this is not a podcast about, look at these things that Christianity is doing. This is about Christian nationalists. They don't represent most Christians. And in fact, there's a lot of Christians who are pushing back on them. So I get asked like, oh, is this anti-Christian? Absolutely not. It's not anti-religion. It's not anti-Christian. It's none of that. It's a look at a movement that has some, radical ideas about what America should look like. And a lot of people who share the faith, if not the ideology, but not the ideology, have big concerns about these guys.
Yeah. Wow. And like, even in just this conversation, there's so much to like think about and digest. I can only imagine like making this podcast, being in these interviews, like how much this was to really process and work through, because just I've listened to a few episodes. It's a lot. So it's fascinating, but it is a lot. So the episodes are dropping. Where can people go to listen?
So the first 2 episodes are out. And as they say in the business, you can get them anywhere you get podcasts. So whatever your favorite podcatcher is, Spotify, Apple, NPR One, it'll be there. And then every Wednesday we will release a new episode. So so you can just sit back and look forward to Wednesdays. And Lindsay, you gave me a new tagline for my series, Extremely American. It's a lot.
It really is. I'm glad I can help out. It's true. And it's just a little spoiler, like a little warning. It's a lot, guys. But with it dropping on Wednesday, that gives you plenty of time, like process, work through it, recoup over the weekend, and be ready to go for next Wednesday. I think that was a genius idea.
There you go. There you go. Yep. It's definitely midweek material.
Yes, absolutely. Can't hit that on Friday. Well, thank you so much. And we're going to have a link to the podcast in the show notes so everyone can jump on, get listening. And thank you so much for coming to break this down with us.
Thank you.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, why not subscribe to our Hey Boise newsletter? We'll be back tomorrow morning with a very special episode ahead of the 4th of July. You'll hear from me and every single CityCast host around the country. It's going to be epic. You won't want to miss it.